Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and we just got done here a couple hours ago with the introductory press conference for James Gladstone, and I wanted to be able to give some thoughts on it, some of the things he said, and I'll just go ahead and say this first and foremost. It's going to be a lot of positive things in this video. It's going to be a lot of positive things on this channel going forward because I really think at the end of the day that the Jacksonville Jaguars made the best hires they could have, especially at the GM position. You can have the debate about Ben Johnson versus Liam Cohen. That was obviously something that was talked about a ton before the hire. I'm personally happy with the way things went, but for James Gladstone, everything we've learned about him and the way he's presented himself, the history of the guy, I think he clearly stands out at this point as the best candidate that was available, and definitely better than Ian Cunningham, just in my personal opinion. And if you've watched this channel before, you know I wasn't super high on him. So, that's something to be considered. But we're going to talk about some of the things that were said here. What is going to change with the Jacksonville Jaguars? And we'll start first and foremost with this, just a small thing. But just mentioning, the people that he thanked along the way. And why I think that's important is because this is someone who, when he came in and interviewed, it was made very clear from everything we've heard and articles on it that it was not a process that was all about him. This was not about his ego. This was not about his self-glorification. It was about how he can come in, build the best team for Liam Cohen, and to be able to work collaboratively with everyone in the building and just put the best product on the field. And on top of that, being thankful to the people who've given him a chance to get here, right? And I think that was awesome to see. I think you very clearly saw the Los Angeles Rams go out of their way over the last few weeks to try to get Gladstone in this job because they felt he was very capable. They wanted him to get the position for his own sake, maybe not for their own, right? Cara Henderson, for example, even said it that, yeah, if he didn't get the job, well, good for them. But, for the sake of James Gladstone, he was a very deserving candidate for this. But this is someone I think who's very professional, someone who has a great background, has learned from some great people, and ultimately understands a lot of what it takes. And you go back, you watch the Rams, right? If you go watch their offseason process, because every team, for the most part, puts up videos about, the draft and behind the scenes stuff, what they can. And the Rams had a lot of stuff, and some of it involved Gladstone. You see a very collaborative process from all of them, right? It is not just one guy dominating the room. You go back to watch the Jaguars stuff from the previous years, and what is it? It's Trent Baalke walking around and talking about who he wants to pick, right? Or it's Doug Peterson, right? It's very rarely other people involved. It's two guys just in a power struggle against each other, and the guy who always won it for 2 weeks, when Doug got fired, and then he was canned as well. But that's in the past, thankfully. Now, just going back to the collaboration here, right? He was asked about the draft dynamic, kind of what do you do if maybe a decision has to be made and is someone in charge, right? Or someone have the ultimate say. Just kind of poking at that, trying to get an idea of, is there a power structure here? And what James Gladstone said was a two-word response. Pure collaboration. And you also saw Tony Baselli talk about this as well, saying the way you have collaboration starts with relationships built on trust. If we keep the focus on what we're trying to achieve, nothing else should matter. And I love this last line. Not our agendas, not our egos. Who gets credit? It starts with the relationships built on trust, right? This is not something, at least from what they've said so far, right? And you got to go prove it. But I do believe them. This is not something about their own self-glorification. This is not about people trying to take the credit for the good things and then to blame the bad things on someone else, right? Because they love to do that. And we've seen a lot of that here in Jacksonville. But these guys understand that, right? That is not something that that you want to be doing. This is a collaborative process. You're in it together. There is no throwing people under the bus to save your own skin. And when you have that kind of environment where you can all collaboratively work together, you're going to usually have pretty good results. You got more brain power involved. And I think if you got some phenomenal people, very smart, innovative young minds on this team, that they should absolutely, have a great brain trust here, right? So, love to see this. And another thing as well that James Gladstone had said, not really hinted at, was that if they have like a serious disagreement on something, or they see something a different way, he said, first of all, that's good. That's fine, right? This is not something that is inherently bad. If they're unable to come to a consensus or to get past the problem, right? And he's specifically talking about maybe how do we look at a player in the draft, right? And this was more so in response to this question asked about the draft dynamic. He basically said that if they cannot come to a conclusion on something together, they feel very differently, they'll pivot from the issue, right? Now, are you going to be able to do that all the time? No, right? This is specifically talking about draft prospects, but it's clear like where they cannot come to an agreement, if it really gets to that point, and I'm not sure it will all that often, they're going to simply set the player aside and focus on someone that they agree on, because they want to bring in people that they're all aligned on, right? Because when you bring in someone that maybe one guy loves him, another guy hates him, well, now you're gonna get division. You're gonna get, if it doesn't go well, the guy who didn't think he'd be good is like, well, I told you so, right? You don't want that. You want guys that you're all in on it together. Now, next thing here, talking about, it'll just mention both these things. When he was talking about where he sees the Jaguars now, James Gladstone compared it a lot to where the Rams were in 2017. I think that's a fair comparison, right? You had a team that wasn't like super successful at the time. There were some pieces to work with, but it was not some powerhouse, right? The Rams were not that. You had a young head coach, smart head coach coming in, although Sean McVay was much younger than Liam Cohen was. So he was like, 30, 31 years old, something crazy like that. But they had a very similar situation. And you've obviously seen how the Rams have built themselves up. They've had ups and downs, but they've very consistently been a competitive team. They haven't been afraid to make changes. They haven't been afraid to be aggressive. And it's won them a Super Bowl in that time. Right? So, they've had great results there. And I would have to say Jacksonville's in a similar situation. Just talking about the head coach, talking about, the dynamic that you have coming in. I do think it's very similar, and that will help have him prepared for how to deal with things in Jacksonville. He also said that Les would have never raised his hand and said, hey, it's time to go be a GM, if he didn't think it was the right opportunity. And I think this makes a ton of sense for him, right? Because you have a good roster you're working with, not perfect, but better than what you're going to get with a lot of teams that are getting new GMs. There's a reason you're hiring a new GM, right? It's usually roster construction. For Trent Baalke, while I have my concerns there, it's a lot more than that. So you had a better roster than what you'd have with most teams. You're also in the opposite conference, which I think somewhat plays into this, to where the Rams would be okay with this if they know the guy's going to go somewhere. You prefer not to have to play him every year in the playoffs, right? Because, you play him once every 4 years and in the Super Bowl if you both get there. So not a big deal to them. And also, you keep in mind as well for Les, he was someone who had actually worked with the Jaguars originally when they started as a team. So I think it made a lot of sense as an opportunity. And on top of that, Liam Cohen being here, a guy that Gladstone knew, they'd worked with for what would have been like 3 or 4 years in Los Angeles of his 8 seasons there. They have a relationship already established. And so this made a lot of sense for Gladstone to come here, and it obviously made a lot of sense for the Jaguars. Once we really felt like we started to understand more about who this guy was, and it was the same for the team itself, right? I mean, they were obviously wowed during the interview process and went from the, Cunningham is consensus to we're getting James Gladstone in here, even though Cunningham wants the job. So, things change, right? Because Gladstone, the more we learned about him, he's an extremely qualified candidate for what we were needing. Now, another thing he mentioned, just talking about where the roster is, he did say that the Jaguars have the highest volume of draft capital that exists for any NFL team. And in the regards he's talking about this is not more so like where you're picking, it's the amount of picks you have. Because the Jaguars do have a lot of selections. I think, I might not know the exact amount off the top of my head, but I think it's like 18. They should have 10 this year. Extras in the 3rd, the 4th, and the 6th from Minnesota and Seattle, respectively. And then next year, you have a pick from Minnesota for Cam Robinson. So, Jacksonville's, they got a lot of draft capital to work with. You might have even more. In addition, if, say a player like Christian Kirk is tradable, or an Evan Ingram is tradable, and they decide to move on from those guys, it could end up being even more than what they currently have. But of course, if you're including the context of where are you picking, yeah, Jacksonville doesn't have the most of every team. But as far as the amount of picks, yes, this would be true. And ultimately, we do have a lot of draft capital compared to most teams. Just getting to the point there. Like, there's a lot this team can do in the draft this year to improve. And we could come out of this thing with, probably 3 or 4, or probably 4, maybe even 5 starters, I would say. That's very feasible to do. We could even trade back in the first round, get another day 2 pick. I mean, there's a lot of options for the Jaguars in this draft, and they're going to come out of it with a lot of pieces that can be used on this team. So I would agree with what he had to say there. Now, another thing here, just talking about the process of what are you looking for in players? And I thought this was great to see, right? Because, I mean, we're so used to the, how long is your arm? Okay, it's not 33 inches. You're going to get kicked off the board, right? It's like the Trent Baalke way. But what Gladstone had to say about it was that, and this actually is pretty much a copy of what he said in the first clip of him in the building, if you're watching that off the Jaguars Twitter from a couple days ago. He said that we'll prioritize people and players that are intangibly rich. And by doing so, they'll elevate our ecosystem, our team, by being nothing more than themselves. So it is as simple as that. And I think that's an incredible approach, right? So many times we're looking for people to come in and be something different than what they are, right? I mean, that's what you did with Trayvon Walker, to be fair. And now, can it work? Of course it can, right? Trayvon has obviously developed into a pretty good football player. Is he worth the first pick? Well, that's the whole debate. I would say no, but he's still a very good football player. He's going to earn a lot of money for very good reasons. But ultimately, when you choose people who have been productive, right, and they've proven themselves not only on the field but off the field, or just in their mind, how smart is this guy? How is he going to translate to the NFL? All those things are really important too. Right? We're talking about intangibles here, not necessarily your size or your arm length. Those things matter, of course, to teams, but I think this is a good approach for this team, and they need people who are going to elevate this roster. They need people who are going to change the culture, right? Because this team, the culture that we've had, it's improved per se from like what we had with Urban Meyer. It's still not in a great spot. There's a lot of work to be done because this team last year, even with how bad the coaching was and just how bad the season went, probably shouldn't go 4-13. Probably shouldn't see some of the mistakes that we saw on the field. So I think this is a really good approach. Of course, I think they're going to consider still, the size and the measurements for people. That does matter. But ultimately, it's what are you going to do with that, right? It's not just a game of, like, what could you be? It's what are you going to be for my football team? And how did they succeed from that last year? Going back to the Rams? Let's see. 2 guys. Jared Verse, Braden Fist, right? Incredible duo. You got the defensive rookie of the year in Jared Verse. You got Braden Fisk, who either nearly got 10 sacks or had 10 sacks on the year as a rookie interior defensive lineman. Neither of those guys had incredible measurements or athletic scores, right? They may have had parts of that. Of course, Braden Fisk is really well athletically, but they were not complete prospects as far as the way they're built. But you go to the mental side of it, considering how they were going to play together, and that's where that ended up being such a huge win for the Rams. So, if Gladstone's going to bring that here, I love it, right? What else can I say? Now, a couple more things to talk about here. I just thought this was kind of cool. They obviously, everyone wants to know, this is such a young group of guys, and it's really not how they've seen it. We've heard this from, I think, Grant Udinsky, and now from James Gladstone, where they just don't look at that, right? But this is a super young group of people. Tony Baselli would be the oldest in this dynamic, and he's 51, 52 years old? So, even that, it's not that far up there. You could still serve in your role for, a couple of decades, maybe even more than that if you wanted to. So, this is a really young group of people, but this line, we start from a place of humility, but there's an aura of confidence, and I don't know what else he said, but it was cool. Obviously, he's paraphrasing here. But humility is a big part of this, right? And that's not that you don't know what you're doing, but it's more so focusing on respecting what others offer, not making it all about yourself. I love that approach. I think that's especially important for the coach-centric environment this is going to be, where Liam Cohen is ultimately, he may not be the most pivotal guy in everything or the most impactful in everything. James Gladstone's going to have a huge part in it, but Liam is the leader of this group, right? He is setting the direction this team wants to go, and ultimately the job of a general manager is to help the head coach and the other coaches accomplish what they want with the roster so that they can succeed with the game plan they want to have. So I think Gladstone's someone who understands that perfectly, right? And that was something I loved about Brandon Brown, why I was a huge fan of him in this process. But man, what Gladstone's offered, the history he has, and offering many of those same things, very clearly made himself the top candidate over all these other guys. Now, one last thing, just a cool quote from Coach Cohen talking about the first time that he met James Gladstone. Gladstone was, I think, put in charge, they say it here, of the UDFA signings for one of their seasons in LA. I think this was 2018, they were saying. And Liam Cohen said, I saw this guy completely dominate that position. The ability to communicate with both scouting and the coaches was just at such a different level than I was used to seeing. And you've already seen it in just the way this guy presents himself to the room. You saw it with how he talked to the coaches. He's professional. He can command respect for a 34-year-old guy, and he earns it, right? And I think the way that he's going to build himself up here in the relationships, he's going to be very successful in trying to do that. So these are some key takeaways I had. If I had to leave it on any note, bold prediction here, guys, and I don't want to say this is 100% for certain, right? Things can always happen. But I genuinely think that we might be in a world where the Jaguars are not searching for a head coach or a general manager for a few decades, couple decades. It might be a long time ago. I think they've got a phenomenal head coach. I think there's risk, of course, because Cohen didn't have a long track record of being an OC. He still learned from some really awesome people, specifically Sean McVay. But that is the concern there. But for James Gladstone especially, I think this guy's come up in a great system. I think he's absolutely qualified for the job. I think the body of work is probably a little bit bigger than Cohen's was for what he's doing. But ultimately, I think these are guys that if you hit on them, and I really get the feeling that they're going to hit on them because I think they understand what so many of the problems were here before. They've heard it. They heard it again at the press conference today when, I can't remember who was asking, but someone was pressing about, oh, the previous issues with the infighting in the building and the staff members and the front office going at each other, right? But I think these guys understand that those things were happening. They understand what the problems were on this team. Where do we need to get better? Not only on the roster, but in just the processes that we have. And with how intelligent, or at least how much potential that they have, and the understanding of what needs to happen, I think this could be a wildly successful offseason for the Jaguars, and maybe the most pivotal as far as getting to long-term success in the history of the franchise. And I would bet on that if I had to bet on something. So we'll see what happens. I am really excited for the future, though. You guys can probably tell. I'm excited to be able to have some positive conversations on here. I've been very tired of just having to give bad news, it seems like, all the time with last season and our leadership and half changes. But we're in a better situation now. I think we've done the right thing this offseason, and now we get to go and hopefully, even if it's not immediate, even if it's not a 10-7 season right out of the gates, I think we're going to get to reap the rewards of waiting a very long time to see this team be successful. So with that all said, I want to shout out our channel members: Premier Seer 904, Nightmare Eco, Gator John Bites, Scrubber Ducky 500, Frangies, and Brian Foster. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. We will have some content on the Combine this week, hopefully tomorrow or Wednesday, for sure one of those days, but hopefully tomorrow I'll put out a video maybe with some players to watch, just different things at the Combine. It might be guys measurements are really important for. There might be guys that medicals are important for, or it might be athletic testing. So I'll give a little bit of a preview on that and just some people will pay attention to. And we'll have a lot of other content, of course, as the Combine goes on. But with that all said, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.